Right, so the topic for today's video is evaluating teaching. So there are many different methods we can use to evaluate whether or not we are effective as teachers. One very common way is using student ratings. Another is to look at student performance. And yet another approach is to do classroom observations that can be done either by a peer or a supervisor. So we'll go ahead and take a look at each of these different methods and some of the pros and cons associated with each one. So student ratings, this is a well-utilized approach that's used across the nation, asking college students to rate their faculty on a variety of different variables and different parts of the class experience. There are some concerns, though, about this class. You certainly can get at student satisfaction, whether they're satisfied or not, but education's a little bit of a different situation. It's not the same as customer satisfaction in a retail business. And I guess some faculty really are worried about whether or not non-experts can really be put in this position of evaluating. You know, how does a student know if you're an expert in the field and you know your stuff? You know, if they don't know that area, it's really difficult for them to judge. They might be able to talk about whether you were timely in giving feedback back and things of that nature, but in terms of your overall effectiveness, a lot of that's going to depend on whether or not you were able to get the content across. And again, they may not be the best judge. There are, of course, also biases that could be at play. If a student, didn't do well on an assignment or, whatever might have happened, those biases could have also influenced evaluation. So sometimes students like to take that out negatively. And likewise, if a student had a good experience, sometimes it's inflated. So student ratings tend to be either like super positive or super negative. They're often not in that neutral zone, and we just have to interpret those with a sense of caution. The other important variable to mention here is that we want to measure our effectiveness of teaching, and learning isn't necessarily getting assessed by using a student rating. So we might be able to assess how well a student thinks they learned something, but we're not really using a direct measure of learning here. So there are certainly limitations associated with student ratings, but they can be a very helpful point of feedback. So they can be a good formative assessment tool. It's essential for you to know what your students are thinking about the way in which you're teaching, because there might be ways that you can improve what you're doing based on their feedback. Now, another approach is to use student performance, and this is fraught with lots of different, red flags associated with it, because there are just too many variables that impact learning. So clearly, the teaching should be one of the primary variables that impact whether or not students learn, but it's not the only variable. You could, of course, have students who are extremely busy, working full-time jobs, not having the time to devote to the class. So you might have structured the task really well, but the student didn't put the time and effort into it because of other competing priorities in their life. So that may not be the best solution. It may also be that you're teaching a course where you have super high achieving students, and yes, they might have performed really, really well, but maybe you didn't play that big of a role in that. It might have been that they are just eager and they were going to do well with or without you. And vice versa. Maybe you have students who are really struggling and, have a difficult time at achieving at high levels, and yet maybe they made significant growth in your class, and that was due to your teaching, but it's not looking at the end of the day like a lot of learning happened, because it still may be a low-level grade. But maybe they really did learn quite a bit in the class. So it's very, very tricky to determine the best way to look at this variable, because there's just so many confounding variables that get in the way. It's not like there's a direct link, teaching causing the learning, and it's also very tricky for us to set up research methods. We don't usually do like a formal study on our teaching effectiveness. So it's just very, very complex. It might be that you have an 8 o'clock in the morning class and people are half asleep, and you might be phenomenal, but maybe your 3 o'clock class in the afternoon, their performance is much better. Well, you might be doing the same thing, but the time of day and some of the other variables can get in the way. As I said before, we sometimes can ask students to do a self-assessment. So one easy way to do this is just take your learning outcomes and put the I am able to phrase right before it. So if your learning outcome was, I am able to create a lesson plan, I am able to give appropriate feedback, whatever it might be, and ask students to judge how well they achieve those goals. Again, that can be helpful, but students aren't always the best assessors of that. Sometimes it's too high, sometimes they're too hard on themselves, and so it's difficult to know if that's really the best way to go or not. So it's a good point of data, but again, fraught with some potential concerns. We have to tread cautiously here as well. Another great way to gather information about the effectiveness of your teaching approach is to have someone come in and observe you. This can be quite intimidating as a faculty member. I know most of us don't like to be evaluated and observed, but the truth of the matter is that it is an enormously powerful way to help you learn and grow and develop. I remember back in grad school, my background's in counseling psychology, and we, in counseling psychology, you can just imagine the level of supervision that we had. The one-way mirrors where people are watching you live, recording things by video and audio tape and analyzing word by word. And yeah, it was a very intense experience, but it also definitely strengthened my ability to provide effective counseling services. So it was really a worthwhile one. So we can do a parallel process in the educational world, and the way that classroom observations can be set up is a three-pronged process. So we should start off by meeting with whoever's doing our observation. Again, this might be a peer in a teaching and learning center, might be a colleague that we know either inside or outside of our discipline, or it could be our chairperson or supervisor. And the pre-observation meeting happens obviously before the observation itself, and I'll go over what happens in that meeting in just a moment. And then you have the actual observation, and then afterwards you need to have that post-observation meeting as well. So let's first talk about what happens with the pre-observation meeting. Well, there are a couple of things that should be talked about. Clearly what the purpose of it is, and the purpose would be different if it's a colleague doing a peer observation versus a supervisor doing an evaluative observation that's going to go into your official file and whatnot at the college. So you want to know what the purpose is. You want to know what are the layers of confidentiality, if any. Is this getting shared with supervisors? Is it just for you and your benefit? And it depends, again, on who you're reaching out to. Most teaching and learning centers will offer some peer evaluation observations, I should say, and they often keep them confidential, so they're not usually shared with administrators. But you need to know what the policy is on your campus, and that's a good conversation to have right before the meeting, before the actual observation takes place. Then during this pre-observation meeting, you should be providing your observer with a copy of your syllabus so they can see the overall structure of your class, how it's going to be set up, and they can see then what is happening in that class itself. So you're talking about the overall learning goals of the class and then the specific learning goals of the lesson that they're coming to observe and how that fits into the overall picture. And then, of course, you want to discuss some logistics. Are you going to explain who this person is? How much time do you want to allot for that? Where should this person sit? What time is the class? Location? Things of that nature. So when you're discussing the class that's going to be observed, you want to have kind of an in-depth conversation about this. So you can talk in general about how is it going, what's working well, what are some of the issues that you are struggling with. And then again, drilling down to that particular class that the observer will be coming to, you want to talk about what are the goals for that particular class, how are you planning to achieve them, so what learning activities do you have planned, and what kind of preparation did students need to do in order to come into the course that day. So if you're asking them to say, do one of the Jigsaw classroom experiences, did they have homework that they were supposed to do in preparation for that activity? Or are you just giving them the activity kind of cold in the classroom and they would work on it together? And then you want to also let them know how this course fits into the context of the overall assignment. So are there any assignments or other things that are going to happen afterwards? In addition to giving the observer a good overview of what you're doing, you also want to specify to them if there's something that you would particularly like feedback on. So let's say, for instance, maybe this is going to be your first time doing the Jigsaw classroom or a first time using an inner-teaching approach or inquiry-based model, whatever it might be. You might want to say, I'm going to try something new and I really want to, if you can help me get some feedback about what worked well with this in particular, that might be helpful. Maybe you're struggling with keeping students on task during group work, then that might be something that you would say to the observer. You know, one of the areas I'm struggling in is I notice students are going after use their cell phones often. When they're in groups, they're not always talking about what they should be talking about. So any pointers, strategies, observations that you have could really help me in that area. So again, you're targeting the observer because there's a lot going on in every class, and that would kind of zoom in on whatever area it is that you want them to focus on. Okay. The observer can also give you feedback on your syllabus in general. So you can use documents such as a syllabus checklist to determine whether the syllabus really did set the stage and provide students with clear expectations and a good roadmap for what's happening, and also motivate and inspire them along the way. So that's one area that you can ask your observer to give you some feedback on. Now, during the observation itself, there are a couple of different ways that you can do this. I'm a big fan of the live. You know, if you can get the actual observer to come to the classroom, I think that is really phenomenal. But it is important for you to know that when there's an external person in the class, it does change the dynamic. So sometimes students might be on their best behavior. You know, maybe they won't engage in those off-task behaviors if there's another person in the room. So the observer may not always be seeing the true experience. So pros and cons, but they are getting the live version and they can kind of feel what it's like to be in that classroom. Some other options are to either video or audio tape the class. Obviously, video would probably be preferable because you would have access to all the nonverbals as well as the verbal. You know, audio is not going to give you the images of the students. Are they looking engaged and interested? Are they maintaining eye contact with the presenter? Are they off task using their phone? You know, those kinds of things wouldn't be evident in an audio recording, but sometimes logistically it's just easier to do the audio recording. So lots of different methods. You have to determine what one works best for you and for your observer. Now, if you're in the live observation, the observer should be taking detailed notes because you can't expect them to remember everything, especially if they're doing more than one observation. They might be doing this for others as well. And, you know, they should be kind of be able to summarize what happened and be able to reflect and provide some guidance, hopefully highlighting some of the things you did well and also providing you with some really constructive feedback about what you might want to do in the future to improve the lecture or the lesson. You might also want to think about using an interactivity chart. So if you are using some kind of discussion or, you know, some way where you're trying to get the students involved, you might want to consider asking your observer to do an interactivity chart. So here's what that could look like. It basically kind of shows them the flow of the conversation. So whenever someone speaks and it's kind of whoever they're looking at, you kind of draw a line with an arrow. And what this can sometimes bring to light for faculty is, oh my, there's this whole section of the room that I am not interacting with and seem really disengaged. So front and center, you know, here you can see there's a lot of activity kind of in the middle of the room, but maybe I need to physically move to a different space or get, you know, different kinds of, you know, tap into different kinds of questions so that others in my class will also be engaged and interested. So basically, an interactivity chart is just a visual chart showing who's participating in the conversation, and that can also be quite helpful. Another way to do it for folks that kind of find this to be hard to map at the moment, you can also just kind of put like little tick marks next to each student if they talked, so you can kind of get a sense of who in the class is talking and how much, and who is not talking as well. Now, after completing the observation, the observer should complete some kind of written document. And as I mentioned before, it should be pretty specific, you know, detailing a summary of what they saw. Mostly it should be focused on observable behaviors. And then after that summary is provided, they should then make some evaluative statements about your strengths and also areas for you to work on. It hopefully will address the area that you identified in the pre-observation meeting as being a target. So if that target was, you know, feedback on off-task behaviors, then there certainly should be some kind of summary about how that went and what their recommendations might be. And the more concrete and specific the examples, the better. So you definitely want to do that as well. So at the post-observation meeting, this is a great opportunity for the faculty member to share his or her reflections. And I often suggest that the faculty does that before the observer, so that they're kind of giving their own flavor and their reflection isn't biased by the evaluator's comments. And then after that, you want to begin with the positive parts and then shift into the areas for improvement. And you want to make sure that the faculty member is able to walk out with an action plan of some specific ways that they might improve that particular area. So let's say, for instance, the jigsaw classroom, they tried that and it didn't quite go so well. And maybe the observer had given them a couple of suggestions. Well, the action plan might be not only to put those suggestions into play, but how. So maybe they're going to do a little more reading on how the jigsaw classroom works. Maybe they're going to go and observe someone else doing the jigsaw classroom. Maybe they're going to spend more time prepping and developing concrete instructions for the expert groups, whatever it might be. So the idea here is that we're giving faculty a lot of different data. So evaluating what we do is complicated, but I think we can accomplish it through a variety of means, and I look forward to talking to you more about evaluating teaching for the sake of improving learning.